Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello everybody, we are on the road today in the Upper West Side of New York City, just beside Columbia University, with a man from one of America's most famous intellectual political families, Steve Schlesinger, a long-time writer, teacher, observer of American life from a remarkable family, very much involved with JFK and Bobby Kennedy. Steve, welcome to Keane on America.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you're very generous with your time, Steve. In early February of 2026, I have to ask you the great question: what has happened to America, Steve?
Well, I think America has done something which has been true throughout its 250 years. It's got into a kind of fractured atmosphere. Remember, even when the American Revolution happened, 1/3 of the people in that revolution were pro-British. So you had a great division there during that revolution, which everybody somehow thinks was very easy to be only on one side. Again, eruptions happened in the Civil War, where the entire South went in succession because they didn't agree with the other countries, other states of the North, and then during the 1930s, when we had the Great Depression, all sorts of movements of fascism and communism grew up because people were so discouraged or disparaging of the federal government. We're going through something akin to that today, which is that we have a kind of right-wing revolution going on. That is being led by a man named Donald Trump, who's trying to impose strictures and religious edicts and all sorts of right-wing ideas onto a country which is fundamentally not ready for that and was not really ready to have all this happen over the last year, which we've just been going through. He right now is only supported by 1/3 of the country, according to the polls. But if you try to impose an ideology which is not freely shared for a country of over 330 million people, you're going to have huge divisions. And if he can only get 1/3 of that support, that means at least 2/3 of the country disagree with him. And under those circumstances, it's understandable why you have such fracture today in the United States.
So, is your response one of business as usual in America? America's been through these crises before and it will go through them again. Or are you suggesting something different has happened?
No, I think this is part of the pattern of America. We always go through periods where we have these deep divisions, usually created by internal crises, but often because of foreign conflicts. And in doing so, in a great democracy, you have to work through the divisions. And that's the great thing about elections. The elections tend to reflect the dominant feelings of the voters, and surely in many ways, I would not predict it right now, but the polling suggests in November the Democrats will retake the Congress, maybe even at least the House of Representatives, maybe even the Senate, only because they're reflecting the emotions and views of the American people right now. So the elections are the great solver of political problems. Unfortunately, it did not work at one point, and that was the Civil War, where those tremendous emotions about slavery could not just be resolved through elections. It had to be dealt with in a open military conflict. But otherwise, most of the divisions in the past in this country have been resolved through the election process. And we'll see how that goes this November, but my feeling is that many of the issues that are apparently very upsetting to Americans, at least the majority of Americans, will be reflected in the outcome of the November congressional races.
Steve, all Americans, of course, have a relationship with their country. They all have views on it, on its strengths and weaknesses. You, as I suggested in the introduction, are from one of America's most distinguished families, intellectual aristocracy. Your father was amongst the most distinguished, influential, powerful historians of the 20th century. Do you think you and the Schlesingers in particular have a different kind of relationship with America than, shall we say, more standard Americans, more typical Americans?
Well, I think that in a way, I grew up with, my father taught at Harvard, my grandfather taught at Harvard, and my other grandfather taught at Harvard, one in medical school, one in history. Even my uncle taught at Harvard, uncle-in-law, he taught Chinese history. So I grew up in a fairly, I would say confined atmosphere of a university town. And to that extent, yes, I think that meant that I was not aware of many of the great feelings and beliefs and struggles that mainstream Americans had. On the other hand, you can look at communities around the world, around the country anyway, who live in gated communities or live in, have various attachments to their factory that they're working at. And each time that you have these little villages of thinking and pausing about what was going on in the country, in a way, they're as isolated in many ways as the community I grew up with at Harvard University. So the question is, how do you bring them all together? How do you make common cause that allows people from various different levels of the economic system and from wealth to the poverty, make them feel a part of the country at large? And I think that struggle has always been the issue that faces every politician in this country. And I do feel that in many ways I had to go through my own struggle of kind of getting away from the Harvard community. And in my case, I moved from Cambridge to New York. I started working in local politics here as well as a journalist, and began to open my vision about what life was all about. And I think that was a very important mark along the development of my own life. I think most people, if they don't ever leave their own one small community, don't get that kind of experience. And so, at least in my case, it really opened my eyes.
What did your grandfathers and your father and all your remarkable family, what did they teach you or not teach you about being American?
Well, my father, as my grandfather, both named Arthur Schlesinger, one senior, one junior, were very great patriots of American life. My grandfather, Arthur Schlesinger Sr, wrote pioneering books about the colonial period of American history, and marveled at the fact that the U.S. developed out of these small little states that had been settled mainly by English religious groups or other European movements, and my father, on his side, marveled at the fact, because he wrote about early American President Andrew Jackson, and then later American presidents Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy, about the resilience of America, in the sense that it's lasted for right now for over 250 years, and it's only been in a sense, struck down only one point in its history by war, and that was the Civil War. But otherwise, it's managed to resolve the issues that are splitting the country through the process of negotiation, election, and the feeling that democracy will solve the problem in the long run. So I think he also feels very patriotic, did feel very patriotic about the country, to the point where he joined the Kennedy administration as a special assistant to John Kennedy, where he could actually see how the government operated from the inside, whereas before he'd only written about it as a scholar from the outside.
He was a central figure in the mythology of the JFK administration in Camelot. He was close to the whole family, including Bobby Kennedy. What are your memories of that, Steve? Is the romance, the nostalgia, is it justified?
I think that, from my own experience, I really regard that time as a very romantic time. I met President Kennedy 3 or 4 times when I was growing up, and to be in his presence, it was as if you were. He had a kind of magnetic personality. He was strikingly handsome. He had a great, wonderful sense of humor. There was just a kind of warmth about him. And you just had the feeling of this young man, he was in his 40s when he became an American president, that he had a dynamism and vision and enthusiasm that could take you to places you never imagined before in this country. And it was a genuine kind of environment that he created. It is fair, I think, to look back on that as a romantic time, because he was unique in the sense that he was also able to use television and radio and all the media outlets of that time in a way that he seemed to leap out through the cameras to the people in the communities. So they felt a feeling of solidity with him and a feeling of admiration for what he was doing. And of course he had a young family, a beautiful wife, all of these quite original factors. He was almost like a movie idol in many ways. His brother, Robert Kennedy, who I got to know a little better, through my father, was also a striking figure, also had a kind of magnetism to him, and a man of great values in terms of where he thought the country should be going. I remember one time that my father took me out to dinner with Bobby Kennedy and a number of other people at a restaurant in New York City. This is when Bobby Kennedy had become a senator from New York. And one of the striking features of Bobby, to me anyway, was that he had great vulnerability. It sounds kind of odd to say that about a man who's always been accused of being ruthless and it's kind of slam bang towards politics and people. But at least in these informal encounters, he talked very honestly about his own feelings about what life was all about. At that particular dinner, he asked us, went around, there were about 7 or 8 of us, went around the table asking us, do you believe in God? Well, I mean, that was in 1967. This is a time when he was already being considered as a possible candidate for the presidency in 1968. And it's just struck me as, why would a man of this intensity and ambition be talking about these issues? And it became clear that he himself was struggling with his own spiritual feeling. He said at one point, I never asked to be born, but I am born, and I am alive, and I have to deal with the life that I have. And religion has been one of the kind of things that have gotten me through terrible crises in the past. And obviously, he was referring to the assassination of his brother 4 or 5 years earlier. And he told us that he'd been reading Graham Greene's book, The Power and the Glory, which is about a defrocked priest struggling with whether he was still religious or not. A reflection of his own inner emotions about whether he still felt religious or not. And remember, the Kennedy family is a strong Catholic family and was brought up, in Catholic schools and very much part of, churches and rituals that are part of the Catholic community. And to have him talk about this struggle with religion was fascinating.
Do you think that confidence, shall we say, in his vulnerability, in his own vulnerability, which you just described, is a reflection of the complexity of the family, of this aristocratic, enormously rich family in a supposedly democratic country? What can the stories of both JFK, you mentioned that he was a Hollywood-like star, and his more vulnerable brother, Bobby, what can that teach us about politics in the 2020s in terms of progressives either coming up with a candidate like JFK who can compete with right-wing demagogues, or perhaps more human characters like Bobby Kennedy?
Well, of course, every candidate for the presidency is individual in their own way. So the Kennedys certainly had what we call charisma, that ability to project a kind of force field of enthusiasm and attraction and almost glitterati in politics, which is not shared by many other politicians. Richard Nixon, for example, did not have any of those qualities, and yet he also became elected president. I think that, first of all, what it says is that at least in politics of this time, when we have so many different media outlets, not only on television, the internet, streaming, iPhones and so on, it's very important for a politician to have a larger-than-life personality in order to kind of grab attention through these different outlets. Obviously, Trump has it because he's been elected twice, and he dominates the airwaves and the print media and all the internet outlets in a way that is quite extraordinary. But it's because he has a personality that is very conscious of how to communicate using all these different outlets. But he also has a powerful personality of his own. In my view, he has the wrong views, but you have to concede that this is one of the strengths he's had as a leader. And I think both Kennedys also had those same strengths, but with in my view, the good views. And so you do have to have a very attractive, powerful character to be able to run for the presidency. People who don't have that extreme ambition and energy and sheer fortitude to go out on a political trail day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, they just drop by the wayside. And so this combination of appealing through your personality and as well as handling the media and coming up with views that are attractive to voters, that's the magic soup, I think, that creates a good candidate.
But coming back to the Kennedys, old Joe Kennedy, first of all, prepared his first son, Joe Jr., to become president. He, of course, died in the Second World War, so he was then replaced by the second son, Jack Kennedy, and then, of course, after the assassination of Jack, by Bobby. In a sense, Joe Kennedy was preparing them all, intellectually, globally, financially. And that speaks to what we talked about earlier, this contradiction between the promise, the ideals of American democracy and the reality of American aristocracy, for better or worse, a country which has always been the home of families of remarkable inequality, of great wealth. Joe Kennedy at one point, I think, was the richest man in America. Is there an argument to be made, Steve, when we look at the Kennedy family, that aristocracy isn't such a bad thing when it comes to training democratic leaders?
Well, I think aristocracy has played a huge role in American history. I mean, after all, Theodore Roosevelt came from a very aristocratic background. His other ancestor, successor, Franklin Roosevelt, was from an aristocratic background. And the Kennedys, as you point out, themselves had that kind of
and all progressives,
pedigree.
of course. Teddy, FDR, JFK, and Bobby Kennedy, all perhaps the four most influential progressive American politicians of the 20th century.
This is true. I mean, it is a fact that some of the most liberal presidents we've had come from these very wealthy, well-established families, and have been able to nonetheless feel the pulse of the common people and respond to their needs and desires as president. On the other hand, we've also had aristocratic presidents who have given little attention to the poor people and have come from very rich families. I don't know if you put Trump in that area, but he did come from a family that had huge wealth when he started in politics, and he's given short shrift to all the issues that progressives have cared about. But by and large, it is a striking factor that if you look back at the great presidents in American history, they have come from these very highfalutin backgrounds. Whether they're very good university education, whether it's the wealth, whether it's the contacts, the community, the social level, all of those factors have helped propel many of these candidates into the presidency and into responding to the needs of the community at large, as opposed to their narrow aristocratic background.
Steve, as you say, you have a number of memories of Bobby Kennedy. You spent some time with him. You gave the anecdote about his vulnerable side, but of course he was also a pretty tough guy, physically tough, involved when he was a young man in many fights, mentally tough in many ways. What do you remember about Bobby's hardness, about his toughness?
Well, that's an interesting question. One day my father took me out to their place, what the hell's it called?
Hickory Hill?
One day my father took us out to Hickory Hill, and
this is the family estate.
The family
outside
estate for
Washington,
Bobby and his kids. And I had not really ever been out there before. And the moment I arrived, Bobby said, "We're going to go play touch football." And I thought, wait a minute, I didn't come out to do that.
How old were you then?
I was about 20, 21. And so we ended up playing touch football. I as you know, touch football, you don't tackle, but you just touch somebody, and that means that they freeze and then that they can't move anymore. But the point was that he had me go out for passes, okay? Now, I hadn't played football in years. And when he tossed me a bullet of a pass, I fumbled it, because it caught me by surprise, but he intended to be very precise in what he wanted to do. He said, "I want you to go out, I want you to catch this pass." When I came walking back, humiliated for having not caught this pass, he gave me a look that made me think, man, you don't push around this guy. You don't mess with him. He wants what you want. He wants what he wants. And so the second time he had me go out for that pass, I damn well caught it, because I didn't want to get the wrath of him from me, failing a duty that he had expected me to complete. So that to me is an illustration a small one from a young kid, but aside to Bobby Kennedy, says he's a tough man. He wants what he wants, and he expects you to live up to his hopes and dreams of what you're going to be.
What was Hickory Hill like?
Hickory Hill was a kind of huge estate. It had a huge swimming pool in the back. It had a big lawn where you could, play football, and I guess they played other sports too. The house itself seemed to go on and on. It had lots of rooms, and of course, he had 11 or 12 kids, and there was a sense of informality about everything. Everybody was kind of bouncing around and trying to do this or that. Everybody had a thing that they liked to do, whether it was a hobby or some of the kids had little animals that they played with. There was a sense of fun. I mean, it was just rough and ready. I remember later talking to Jackie Kennedy in one of the few times I ever had a chance to speak with her, and she told me that she wanted to keep her son and daughter away from the Bobby's family because she felt that they were so many of them, and so kind of loosely able to go anywhere they wanted, and kind of free to do everything that she didn't want her kids to do. That she felt if her two kids got exposed to them, that this would be disruptive to her own family. So it was a different style. Bobby was full of excitement and let's do things, and we got to all get together and wrestle and take trips and climb mountains. And Jackie was much more, let's get your education and do the things that are going to get you a good job later on, and stick with the tried and true lives of what I would call aristocracy.
Your father knew both men very well, worked with both men closely. How did he distinguish between the two of you?
Well, my father was closer to Bobby than he was to Jack, but he loved them both. I mean, Jack Kennedy was more reserved. He had he didn't express his emotions the way Bobby did, and but yet you felt this kind of magnetism about him, that he had strong feelings about things, and that he wanted to do with his life, fulfill changes in America as a country in good ways, whether it was in civil rights or disarmament or working with getting treaties passed like the Test Ban Treaty. Whereas Bobby, while he was very committed to all the issues his brother cared about, was much more intense and emotional and open about his feelings in a way that also had a very huge attraction to people. And it gave you that sense of his vulnerability, whereas Jack was a self-composed man, but nonetheless knew his strengths and weaknesses, and was able to accommodate all the different issues he had from growing up in a way that made him a quite extraordinary president. And I think Bobby would have been an extraordinary president, but in a different way, with all the issues he would care about were the same as brother, but he would have articulated them differently, and he would have probably campaigned for them in his own eclectic way, his own special magnetic way that I regard both of them had. So those to me, the composed Jack and the emotional Bobby were the two strains of those two brothers.
What are your memories of the two assassinations, Steve?
The first assassination happened while I was at Harvard as an undergraduate, And I remember being absolutely torn. I mean, this man had become so much of a part of our family because of my father's involvement with him, and he was an idol at Harvard. He'd gone there as an undergraduate, and he had that charisma that you couldn't, delineate. You couldn't write it down. It was part of his being. It's not something you can just adopt. You can't say, I'm going to be charismatic. You either have it or you don't. So I was absolutely shaken up, and I that day flew down to Washington, and my father took me to the White House where the many mourners had gathered. I did not go into the White House. My father actually was asked by the family, Kennedy family, to go look at the Kennedy's body to find out whether he should be in an open coffin or not. And my father said no, he didn't feel. He felt that the damage done by the bullet was too terrible for that to happen. But I did remember watching after an afternoon at the White House, a cortege of actually a series of black limousines leaving the White House. One of them had Lyndon Johnson, the new president, inside, and that was a startling thing because I suddenly realized we have a new president. This is somebody that we're going to be having as a new figure in the White House, and it kind of abruptly brought me back to the reality of what was going on. So I do remember that very, very, very vividly. As for Bobby's assassination, I was I had just finished Harvard Law School, and I was taking the state law bar exam.
And this was, of course, June 1968.
This was June of 1968.
Was particularly 3 months after MLK had been assassinated.
This has been a totally troubling period. Martin Luther King's assassination, 3 months before Bobby's, and then Bobby's being shot in Los Angeles in a way that you had the feeling the country was falling apart. I mean, how could you have so much violence, having survived an assassination 4 or 5 years earlier of our American president? It gave us all such anxiety about what do we do with our lives? How do we go on to the next days? Where do we fit? Can we get into a routine that brings me back to a more peaceful time? All of these issues swirled around in my mind.
You said you were taking an exam. Do you remember the moment you heard?
I do not remember the exact moment, but I will say that as a result of that assassination, I took my mind off the reviews for the exam, and I failed the exam in the end. I just was so blindsided by what was going on. I just couldn't focus or concentrate on the whole notion of passing this test, and it was so I had, in a sense, it derailed me at that time, and but I don't remember the exact moment of hearing the news. By then I was had been living in Cambridge at Harvard Law School for the last 4 or 5 years following my undergraduate years there, and so I had sort of gotten more detached from Washington, and my father was no longer living in Washington; he was living in New York. So the connection to the Kennedy family had kind of lapsed in those years that I was at law school, and it did not mean I did not feel terrific anger and upset and absolute anguish over what had happened to Bobby, but I didn't feel the intensity of the relationship as strong anymore.
Do you think he had a chance to be president? It still seems to be a great debate. Some people say that it was almost mathematically impossible for him to have won the Democratic nomination. Others suggest that he would have been a shoo-in. And of course, then he would have faced off against Richard Nixon in another Nixon-Kennedy election.
Well, I mean, I personally believe that if Bobby had won, had lived, that I think he would have had a hard time getting the nomination. But Humphrey was so weak at that point. I mean, he was so associated with the Vietnam War that I suspect a lot of Humphreyites who did in the end vote for him for the nomination after Bobby's assassination might have broken away from him on the theory that Kennedy was representing the real strong feelings of Democratic voters in his anti-Vietnam campaign, and that he also had this strong charisma which Humphrey lacked, and that Humphrey had been kind of defenestrated by Lyndon Johnson. He'd been, weakened by this very strong president who ordered him around and made him look like some meek follower or a kind of hanger-on as opposed to a real figure in his own right. And I think, from my point of view, it would have been close, but I think Kennedy could have pulled it off. I know the other argument is that Humphrey had the mainstream Democrats on his side. He had all the supporters of Lyndon Johnson on his side. Had many of the state leaders on his side, because he was the man always considered as the next presidential nominee. So it would have been a struggle. But I do believe that Kennedy would have won it in the end.
Steve, you've gone on to become a distinguished historian. One of your best-known books is a book about the foundations of the United Nations. The Kennedy family has, again, typically ambivalent Kennedy way, a very complicated relationship with America's role in the world. Old Joe Kennedy, of course, was in some ways an isolationist, very controversial in his relations with Nazi Germany and in his determination, it seemed, in the late 30s, early 40s, to keep America out of the war. And yet he turned out two boys, Jack and Bobby, who were committed internationalists. As I said, you've written about the foundations of the United Nations. They were both, in their own ways, very comfortable with America's place in the world. Given now the enormous controversy about America's new place in the world, Donald Trump's retrenchment, if that's the right word, from America's role in supporting democracy and its relations with Europe and its commitment to world peace and global institutions, what should we remember about the Kennedy boys' commitment to internationalism and America's central role in that?
Well, I think let's first talk about Jack Kennedy. You remember, after he came back from England, he wrote a famous book called Why England Slept.
Yeah, it was a bestseller. It was remarkable. He was about, 22 or something?
Exactly. It was a bestseller, and basically he made the argument that the British fell down in the preparations for possible war against the Nazis. And it was only Churchill who finally woke them up in time. But so they were ill prepared for a Second World War. And he also had become a hero during the war itself, when his PT boat was sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer, and he was able to survive the attack and bring a number of his crewmates. He had to tug with debris and bring them along, swimming to an island nearby, and save their lives. So he was a man who had experienced war, had written about what war preparations you need if you're going to win a battle, and somebody who, in 1945, after he'd gotten out of the war, became the correspondent for the Hearst papers covering the San Francisco conference that set up the UN in 1945. So it was clear he had a grand view of what the world was all about, that America had to be part of the community of states around the planet. It could not isolate itself in contradiction to what his father believed. And then when Kennedy became president, he was the only president who ever mentioned in his inaugural address the importance of the United Nations. So you can tell you right there where his head was at in terms of international life and how America fit in to the world community. And Bobby, on his part, was, had figured as the Attorney General in a number of episodes that were involved foreign intrusions, mainly the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he and his brother helped settle through a series of negotiations, many of them done through the United Nations, but also hammered out in these small national security meetings at the White House. So they both had a tremendous knowledge of international affairs and the importance of America having allies in order to survive in a very troubled world. I mean, one of the great lessons of the Second World War is that America won that war, but not alone. It won it because it had its European allies, it had the Soviet Union, which was traditionally an antagonist of ours, but that was the only way you're going to win the great battles, is to have allies. And both Bobby and Jack understood that was part of what the American presidency should be all about. That's what both Kennedys stressed in their own arguments about how do you conduct American foreign policy. It's something we've lost as of today with Donald Trump, who doesn't really believe in allies, believes you should have an American first policy. You go it alone. You pick up some allies here and there, but you don't commit yourself to, organizations like NATO or to the UN. You everything is done unilaterally, and I think he's making a grave mistake, but it's not a mistake the Kennedys made.
A couple of months ago, Steve, we had your friend Chris Matthews, Mr. Hardball, MSNBC, on the show. He'd written a book to honor Bobby Kennedy's 100th year anniversary, the 100th year anniversary of his birth in 1925. He was born in November 1925. And Chris's book was about lessons that we should still learn from Bobby. I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at the book, but are there lessons that we can still learn in early 2026 from Bobby Kennedy? He hasn't been around for a long time, but he still has an enormous emotional weight. Many people, including yourself and Chris Matthews, still have a great deal of nostalgia for such a remarkable man.
Well, the thing about Bobby is his intensity, his belief in truly improving the lives of the people of the United States in a way that you don't see very often in politicians today. I mean, Bobby was willing to go into the slums of Harlem and into the poverty places in Mississippi and talk directly with impoverished individuals who had practically no money to live on and dwelled in shacks or had no cars, had to walk everywhere. He cared about these people, and it came through in the way he conducted his life. And I think that would be one great lesson for me is the caring, the compassion, the feeling that, you may come from a very wealthy background, but you can sympathize about the impoverished people of your own community, and you try to help them out, and you try to improve government, and you understand that government can be a dynamic force in lives, that it's not something to be objected to. It's there to help people, And that, of course, is the great division between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans basically believe in small government. Democrats believe in a forceful big government, which cares about the community as a whole, not the narrow rich people that the Republicans tend to focus on. And I think the Kennedys, Bobby in particular, was so broad-minded in his intense feelings about his country people, his countrymen and women, that lesson should be one that I think Democratic candidates in the future should draw on. And I think it is a helpful ingredient in a successful campaign to have that compassion and show it as part of what is important about American values as a country. And those values have kept us together for 250 years.
Let's end where we began, Steve, with your thoughts about the future of America. I know you've got young grandchildren. What wisdom, given your long life in American politics and studying American history, what wisdom would you or do you pass on to your grandchildren about America and being an American in the 21st century?
Well, one of the most important pieces of wisdom, and for my part, as regards that question, is that every American has a civic duty. Now, what do I mean by civic duty? I mean, if you're going to live in this country, you have to care about how the country conducts its life. That means voting. Voting is part of your civic duty. Caring about issues that are going to affect you and your community, and being willing to fight for them or fight against them if they're wrong. Making sure that any job you take in life is one that, yes, it will make you money, but it doesn't exclude you from being involved in the greater community at large, and worrying about your compatriots and your neighbors, and wanting to be part of a much larger populace. And I think in the end, it's the values that the founders established through the U.S. Constitution of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all the freedoms that we have lived with for the last 250 years. We cannot discard them. We have to stick by them. Every new generation has to fight again. It's like a refight for the same classic freedoms that we treasure from the Constitution. We have to refight for them every new generation, because there's always going to be a dynamic in the background which is trying to wipe those freedoms out. And so right now, I would tell and have told my grandkids, the Trump phenomenon is a bad phenomenon for this country, because it is contradicting the great virtues of American life, particularly as they are exemplified through our U.S. Constitution. But we can get through them. We have to fight them, and we will win elections in the future, which will change us back to our traditional values. But that is a fight that never ends. You have to be committed to it throughout your life, and that is your civic duty.
Well, Stephen Schlesinger, real honor to have you on Keen on America. Thank you so much for your wise memories of the Kennedys and their relevance in the 2020s. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.